I have three simple questions.
Three. Only three.
What,
Only
what
three.
what is self? What is temporality? And how are the two related?
Fuck, Nevin. Come
So
on.
somebody should be
Come
able to answer
on.
those three questions. And
Chase, you're up, my friend. Super easy. Easy
I
peasy
don't know
lemon
any of
squeezy.
that. Honestly, this section was difficult. Yeah, if you're expecting answers from me this week, I'm gonna have to disappoint everyone. I mean, I'm not even gonna like pretend to do the bullshit thing that I normally do. Um, yeah. Okay, but the self temporality and the relation between those, God. I don't know. I don't really understand Heidegger's take on the self exactly. I get what he's critiquing for the most part, approximately for the most part. Um, but I don't he's got this like self-constancy thing still going, and I don't other than like an authentic relation to temporality as constant in anticipatory resoluteness. I don't know. I think the answer to everything, though, in some way, is authenticity, anticip anticipatory resoluteness, and temporality. I think the answer to pretty much everything from here on out will be one of those answers, probably multiple ones, because what is the relation between those?
I
So
was
that's my
so
answer.
I, I was so confused about his aspect of the self because it almost seemed like he was saying that the self was more of a condition or um like a byproduct characteristics of existence rather than its own unique thing. Um, and that's because like he got in points where he was saying that like the inauthentic, like how we lose ourselves in the inauthentic existence, and it covers it back up, and then the what there isn't the self according to him, it's Dasein. And then he seems to be suggesting that the self isn't an entity. It's a byproduct of being. And that byproduct or that characteristic of being, like Dasein's the only entity, and that care is tied to that with resoluteness, and that individuation of care, that dread, is what kind of gives you an aspect of that characteristic of self. But he seems to be suggesting that it's not an entity. Like he wants to, instead of ask, I think he's like leaning towards saying, instead of us asking, what is self, like from like the subject object model, he wants us to ask, what does it mean to be who I am? And I think that's where he's leaning towards from this like ontological analysis aspect of it.
so I mean, I seems largely right. My sense is extremely vague. He only gives us that one section on like what is it authentically, and I mean, he's talked a lot about the they self. So existent. It's like the self is. God, I found a quote. I mean, there was a quote that was along this line, but self is not the ground of existence. Existence is the ground of self. So, I think of like it seems like in some ways you could say subjectivity for I'm gonna have to, Eric will probably correct me, but I'm tempted to say for Kant and Husserl, subjectivity is the ground of being, something like that, the ground of existence. Whereas Heidegger says, no, it's the other way around. Existence is the ground of selfhood. And so selfhood is secondary to, it's not identical to Dasein, it is secondary to Dasein. And so these are just, my sort of poorly formed thoughts. So the general sense I get is that self is is something like the experience of mindness, the experience of individuality. And that what constitutes that? Well, he's been talking about all, for quite a while. It's this, thrownness, facticity, being toward death. And so Dasein is being in the world. And I think self is just the experience of that being individuated. I mean, that's the only thing I can make
Yep.
sense of it.
Yep.
And also the unity. I mean, it seems like to a significant degree, especially when he was talking about Kant, he's trying to account for what Kant accounted for with the transcendental unity of a perception. The experience of my world being my unified world, and that he's trying to account for that without appealing to a transcendental unity of a perception, and instead giving an account, which I do not understand at all, that has to do with temporality instead. So I think that the self, I mean, I think he's trying to do something similar to Kant, and that in that his objective is to give an account of the unity of immediate individual experience. And the self is, maybe that's all the self is the unity of individual experience. But it's not subject, and it's not substance. It's that aspect of Dasein, of existence. So existence is primary, self is secondary. It's that aspect of existence, of Dasein, that it just probably is the unity of the individual experience, something like that. That's the best I can make out of it.
Okay. Go ahead.
No, I was gonna say that it's largely how I interpret it, and he seems to be criticizing Kant in a way by like falling into the Cartesian subject object model. Like I think he's suggesting that Kant sees the self as something that is God, is it present at hand? Like is that what he's calling it? There's presence at hand, and then what's the other one that are projects?
Ready to hand?
Ready at hand. I can't ever remember between presence and readiness. I'll get it right sometime. I think he's suggesting that Kant had it somewhat right in the categories of experience, but that Kant considers the self as a present or presence at hand object, which kind of robs it of the ontological inquiry.
I mean, Kant explicitly avoids trying to do that. But maybe Heidegger said ultimately he fails. I think that's because Kant is just like the transcendental ego is not a thing. It is not a substance. It is not. He keeps hammering on that, but I think I get the impression Heidegger thought that ultimately then he ended up treating it like a thing. Is that what you thought, Eric?
Yeah, that's how I read it, right? Heidegger is saying that despite Kant's protestations, his subject, although not explicitly taking on the character of the substance, Kant is that subject is not a substance, which again, Fichte and Hegel will challenge. But Heidegger says, despite that, he still defines the transcendental unity of a perception as the I think, which must accompany all of my perceptions, and the way he conceives it as a subject within time that may be here or may not be here in the same way that any other present to hand object may or may not be here, which doesn't apply to the ontological mode of self, where not being existent is a possibility, but never one that's ready to hand in the same way as it is present to hand. So I mean, again, the key difference is the temporality. How Kant conceives of temporality in the subject or around the subject and Heidegger.
Would I be correct? Would I mean, I don't remember that he explicitly said this, but would Heidegger say that Kant's notion of time is the vulgar sense of time? Like
Yeah, I would say it's probably I would think Heidegger would say it's predicated off of the vulgar conception of time. It's not like his ontological conception of the time, although it's hard to reconcile the Kantian understanding of time with what we usually regard as vulgar, as the common sense, half-baked understanding, half-educated understanding of something. I think Kant's conception of time is a little bit more refined to immediately lend it the term vulgar. But I think you're right. I think Heidegger would say like this Kantian conception of time is still like kind of mostly composed out of the vulgar or the common ordinary conception of time in that it's moments are conceived primarily as successive.
mm-hmm.
Like just in the same way that we can get to a bad, I think similar to Hegel's critique of the bad infinity, but our conception of time, as almost analogous to space. If you just take things and add them up, then you get this long line, and each moment is indifferent to every other moment. They just flow, and so each moment might as well be a present at hand, object in time, just like an area of space might be a present at hand area carved out of space.
So instead of like the spatial temporal lenses of time that Kant proposed, Heidegger is leaning more towards the fact that time needs to be like that future, the horizon that you're going towards something, particularly because that aspect of the future is meaningful to me in some way in which, the self exists. It's almost like a mode of existing for the authentic self for him.
I would say what I see Heidegger doing here is actually kind of radical. Like and I don't know if he would use these terms. I think others might use these terms to kind of take the Kantian project and push it further, radicalize it, right? So for Kant, again, his project is largely epistemological, largely, and so he conceives of time from like within, the finite subject with no purchase on eternity, right? And so as a form of intuition, we might as well think of time as our way of mapping our experiences, one of two important ways of mapping our experiences. So it's very anthropocentric, the way Kant kind of situates time as a form of intuition, which the subject brings to experience. And I think Heidegger is doing something very similar here with temporality. It's not anthropocentric as quite, but it's in the same vein, right?
Yeah, because it gives it significance.
Not anthropo, but Dasein centric, right? He wants to be even more general than the human being, but the being there, right? But it's centered to the being there rather than the human.
This is just one of the many things that I'm really, really struggling with this idea of temporality. But if I remember right, he says that the having been, I've forgotten how he puts it, grows out of the future. And I really don't have any idea what that means.
I'm not 100% on that, but I have a way of kind of getting into again. So I mean, let me backtrack a bit, to kind of further push my point that I see him as kind of taking Kant and pushing it further. And I don't know, to the best I understand Fichte's project, I think there's affinities to Heidegger and Fichte. taking Kant and pushing him forward. And I want to say, like, to answer your original question, what is the self? What does it have to do with temporality? Right. I would say he modifies Kant and says, the self is and this is again a little bit off the cuff. The self is the I care, which must necessarily attend all of my, dealings with interworldly objects, in my world, right? In order for me to have a unified experience of the kind of being that cares in a world of meaningful interworldly objects. There must be an I care that attends all of these comportments. And then from this description, he seems to set it up that this notion of caring, right, is in the first instance, or at least projected forward, or future oriented. In the first instance, like the authentic being as oriented towards one's own most possibility, which is the death, right? And that starts, but you could even think of it in the inverse, right? If for any human being and most non-human beings, like one of our primary overriding concerns is survival. And in order to understand how to survive in this world, we take stock of what's around us and how it got to be this way. And so we might devise a history of how things got to be this way, but it's all pursuant to the primary aim of surviving yet another day, right? So it starts with the future, but out of the future, we take stock of where we are and how we got to be here, and we realize we recognize what was always already the case, or yeah, there's the temporality works itself in through that, caring, having projects.
So I'm always sure I'm saying something incorrect when the way I express things, but so would it be like we are future oriented, and so therefore any understanding in Heideggerian terms, not necessarily cognitively, but any understanding of the quote past is sort of pre-interpreted by our future orientation, our projectedness into the future, something like that.
That's what I'm taking that to mean, yes.
That's how I read 313, where he said that the self project grounded in for the sake of itself in the future as an essential quality of existentiality. Its primary meaning is the future. And I think I found that section too, because I have it underlined, Nevitt, where he's saying that in the middle of that paragraph, as long as Dasein factually exists, it is never past, but is already having been, in the sense of I am as having been. And further down, he talks of like, thus existing Dasein can never identify itself as an objectively present fact, to get out of that subject-object model, that comes into being and passes away with time, in quotes, and is already partially past. It always finds itself only as a thrown fact. In attunement, Dasein is invaded by itself as the being that's still existing it already was, that is constantly is having been. So I think it's that aspect of kind of like what Eric's talking about, like instead of these spatial temporal lenses, the future is how it's meaningful to me, and the self here is not cogito ergo sum or sum, or however you say it. It's not I think therefore I am. It is I am a being who cares, and this is how I have expressed my care, with its own individuation and dread.
Yeah, the priority of the future thing, I think that, so what is Dasein? Authentic Dasein in its own most, what it really is this relation to its finite end, which is also its own individualized possibility, it's death. So I think if you focus on the aspect of where it's about death, that makes it a little more concrete. So I think a lot of what he's talking about is basically if you think of your relation, okay, your existence as this relation to your own temporal span that has this finite end, then your death is this limit that determines all the possibilities that you can do with your existence. And to be oriented towards that final end, which isn't necessarily a stoppage, but it's the limit case of your possibilities. After I die, I'm nothing. So to be oriented towards death and the understanding that you're finite, I think that's the main thing. And that's also what the future is about. So to be oriented towards your death is to be oriented towards your future, your possibilities. And from that, the relation with the having been,
Mhm.
I think that comes down to something like, okay, I could be related to my death, oriented
Mhm.
towards it in this authentic way,
Yeah, I'll be right there.
but what exactly am I relating to it other than what I've been thrown into, which is what I have been. So in a way, you're bringing your facticity along as what you're projecting into the future as your possibilities. So it's kind of like it's almost like it's the past is this material, for definitely lack of a better word, that is what is projected as your future possibility. So I think that's probably the best way that I can explain it. And then out of that, the present also magically appears as the situation in which you can act. But yeah, that part I don't. I mean, a lot of those, the relations between those, this is something that I thought I had at least a sketchy understanding of before reading this book. And now after reading it, I'm like, I don't, I'm less sure of my understanding of it. Um, but I think
Welcome to the club.
if you think about it just in just very try to think about it in the most concrete way as just like, oh, he's just talking about if you're oriented towards your death, if you think of that, that's this authenticity, that's this being oriented towards the future. What is oriented towards the future? It's what you're thrown into, which is your past. That's that's not a past that's like, oh, it's just like back there. It's a past that is still you kind of bring along with you as something, as what is projected into your future.
But that sounds like that. I mean, that sounds like that would make the past, like your past is affecting the future, like your future possibilities are, if not determined, are at least influenced by, the weight of the past that you're always carrying along with you. But I can't, I'm trying to find the quotation, but he says something like the having been grows out of the future, something like that.
Well, see,
It sounds like it's kind of the other way around.
well, yeah, because I interpret that, maybe I'm wrong, but I see that as being something like whatever our like a DOS science projects are, like that they're taking up is going to make them kind of interpret their past in different ways and like maybe pull out meanings of the past that were always there, but maybe were not foregrounded, depending on which kind of future orientations you're taking up, if that makes sense. Like some things will become salient in your past or society's past or whatever as you take on a new project, that before were, maybe there but not relevant. Yeah, I guess maybe like relevance might be a word to apply to that. But at least that's how I interpret it. But
So I think one thing to keep in mind, yeah, so there's definitely this priority of the future, but at bottom, all these uh ecstasies of temporality, I guess that's the technical, hopefully that's technically correct. But all those are unified ultimately. So they all kind of lock into each other. And that's what gives, so also that temporality and the unity of temporality is what gives the unity of the structure of care, which is Dasein's being. So there's that unity aspect to it. And I think the best way to think of that is as something like a movement where you have, a circular movement where the past, I think, isn't just this static thing, nor is the present any kind of a static thing. That's the main thing that I think he's attacking with his idea of temporality, because the ordinary conception of time is this kind of, there's only the present, and the past is simply a former present. So there's a priority of the present at hand, all that. But the past, if you think about it, as it's already has this forward motion towards possibilities. So that facticity wouldn't be my facticity if it wasn't already incorporated in my way of temporalizing myself as oriented towards my future, towards myself as a possibility. So that future aspect is already implicated in the past. And I think that's what he's getting at by saying something like, I can't remember the exact line of, yeah, the future, from the future, you get this having been. It arises from that. I think it's that the having been, the past, is already connected with this ahead of itself, projecting of itself towards its possibilities. If it wasn't, then it wouldn't be incorporated in Dasein's facticity.
And it's interesting you say that because on the Stambon 314 at the end of 329, it's where he was talking about this temporalizing the temporal. I can't say it, man. I'm gonna read it. Primordial and this is 314, bottom of the pair. Primordial and authentic temporality temporalizes itself out of the authentic future, and indeed in such a way that futurely, having been, it first arouses the present. The primary phenomenon of primordial and authentic temporality is the future. And what's interesting to me about that is that, like, our aspect of existence, our eyes who care, like, we to give meaning to it, we have to look at ourselves. We're not getting this from some teleological source. We're not getting this from some deontic duty. We're not getting what it means to be from some religious mysticism. The source of truth of our own existence is ourselves in our own temporality. And that's almost circular in a way, because the problem of existence stems from existence. So it is kind of circular, but the meaning of existence lies with our existence. So it's not outside of it. It's cemented in temporality. And he seems to be leaning towards that if you want to find what it means to be, you have to have this authentic resoluteness to the future and actually look to yourself to see what it means to be for you. And it may be repetitive. And it's what's interesting, and I was thinking about it in terms of practical examples of like when I enjoy something that's really complex, if there's like a particular segment of code, or if there's a piece of music that I think is really beautiful, I can listen to it and kind of like get escaped in the moment because it's circular and I've heard it before, or I can actively engage and listen to it and see what it means to me in that moment. So it was almost kind of this poetic aspect to his philosophy, or when I'm engaging with my children or driving into work or doing the mundane, the I can either look at it as teleological and just get escaped into the they self, or I can take that moment to be like, okay, here's an aspect to talk to my son before I can drive him into work and get to know him better as a human being and perhaps myself as well. So there's that they self component. It's really kind of neat in that regards that there's this beauty that requires authentic resolution and introspection in a way that's participatory. Um, I like that. I'm done rambling. I'm sorry. I was thinking out loud.
This I was going to read it's the last paragraph in section 64, which is on Heidegger 323. So this last paragraph: care does not need a foundation in a self. Rather, existentiality as a constituent of care provides the ontological constitution of the self-constancy of Dasein, to which there belongs, corresponding to the complete structural content of care, the factical falling prey to unself-constancy. The structure of care, conceived in full, includes the phenomena of selfhood. The phenomenon is clarified by interpreting the meaning of care, which we defined as the wholeness of being, of Dasein. And so again, maybe I'm stating this incorrectly, but again, this also again the sort of thing that it seems to me that selfhood is secondary in the sense there is not a self, there is not a unified self that so like there's not a transcendental ego, a unified self that that generates, or that's again probably not the right Kantian word, but that grounds the unity of my experience. The unity of my experience is grounded in the existence of Dasein and in care as a phenomena. And so care does not need a foundation in a self. Existentiality as a constituent of care provides the ontological constitution of the self-constancy of Dasein. So, and I don't understand really why, but this existentiality as a constituent of care, that's what provides, I think, what Kant thought the transcendental unity of a perception provided. That's where the unity comes from. Whatever that means, the existentiality as a constituent of care provides the constitution of self-constancy of Dasein. And then, so the structure of care conceived in full includes the phenomenon of selfhood. So I think again that it's something about the phenomena of existence and Dasein as care, that in itself is the unifying factor. And then the self is, I guess, the experience of that unity, something like that. The mindness, the experience of this is I think Eric said something like this, like this is the world of things I care for, but that I is not primary. That I sort of emerges from this unified phenomenon of factical existence. And maybe it's because we're thrown into the world in a factical way. Maybe that's where that origin of unity is. I'm not sure, but that's why I keep. It seems to me that this selfhood is something that manifests something that is already primary, prior to that experience of selfhood.
Yeah, yes, I am interpreting it as a similar way. The self is not defined in a vacuum. It's a characteristic of Dasein.
Yeah, I think so.
You said factical. Is that
Mhm.
the word? I, how would you understand factical?
Presence at hand, duh. I I
So
literally had
Chase,
to look it up.
well,
Sorry.
or somebody will have to correct me if I'm wrong, but he again he has these pairs of words that he uses to describe features of Dasein, existence compared to features of things not like Dasein. And so, things not like Dasein you can describe in terms of categories, for example. Whereas in Dasein, he uses this word existentials. There's these structural features of Dasein. You can't use the word category because that applies to things not like Dasein. And I think facticity and factual are like that. You can describe facts about the world, but Dasein as existence, there are not facts about Dasein, but there's these factical characteristics, which means, again, I think it's that you are thrown particular, I am a thrown being in a world. Factical has to do, I think, with the particularities of this Dasein,
But it's tied to experience, right?
I think he would say it's tied to being. It's
But the way you were
features of
talking
my
about,
being that are they just are what I am. And I have this body. I was born in this place and this time and so on.
sure, but the way I was trying to follow you, Nevitt, is the unity experience is grounded by design and care. It emerges from factical existence. So I thought you were making a distinction between factical and factual in the lived experience, begging your pardon for saying it this way, but the factual experience, the factical experience of any particular fact. What I'm trying to say is, I'll use a very mundane example. People's personal taste when it comes to food or something. Some people like chocolate, some don't. Chocolate is chocolate, and if you have a factual idea of chocolate, that's not going to tell you for lack of a better term, person's factical experience with this thing called chocolate because of the sum total of the experiences of these persons.
I think he would put factical under the ontic, factual, Jesus Christ, these terms, factual under the ontic category, and he would put factical under the ontological or the existential category, the being category. So like factual would be the certainty that the chocolate bar exists in the ontic category, and the factual would be kind of like your status or mode of being in that particular project at hand that you did or did not like chocolate. That is factical rather than factual. I think.
So my sense is that factical, as ontological, I think factical is just every Dasein is always a concrete individual in a world. That's an ontological characteristic of Dasein. Facticity is an ontological characteristic of every Dasein. But then, and here I'm really not sure, but then when I look at this Dasein, that facticity has very specific features, like this body, this time, born in this time, in this place, in this culture. And so factical I think as ontological is just saying every Dasein has these individual instantiating features. But then when you look at Dasein, at this Dasein or that Dasein, there are certain factical characteristics of this Dasein. That sounds, yeah. I don't know. Is that right, Chase?
Yeah, Chase, are we right?
Yeah, I think so. So I think one way to also phrase it is, well, I mean, this is kind of what you were saying anyways. So facticity is what Dasein is thrown into. So it's the being that it finds itself as in a state of mind or attunement, in a mood. So it's kind of what is already kind of brought to the table by the fact that you're existing, you're having been, and you don't know exactly the whence of where it's from, but you just know that that's what is determining the state of mind in which you're in, which goes into the whole, well, that's also kind of like this basis for what you then are oriented towards the future towards. So it's kind of like the facts for Dasein, but that relate to the kind of total package of its being as it finds itself there in a mood, in a state of mind, attunement, as something that's just simply open to the world. And yeah, difficult to explain. I don't know if that make any sense? I don't know.
So is it correct to say that for example, that me being born on a certain time to certain parents and a certain culture, blah, 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 that those are factical features of this Dasein? Would that be a correct way to speak?
I think that's included in a Dasein's facticity but of course that would be ontic or related to the individual entity.
No.
But I think the relation between those, so your facticity is itself an existential, it would, or it's ontological.
Mm-hmm.
But then it's something that is ontological and existential that also includes these ontic determinations about you, as well as the other ontological aspects as well. So I think it includes kind of all of those.
So
it brings kind of like the whole being there to you as what you are.
So would it be going too far to, using Ed's example, which I don't remember in detail, but to say, I like chocolate more than vanilla? Is that an ontic feature of my facticity?
That's definitely ontic. Yeah. I think anything that's kind of like a sort of personal, individual determination like that's pretty much the definition of ontic. There's nothing ontological about Dasein that's, like a universal of Dasein that is about specific taste. But you could maybe say something like that we all do have some kind of something like a taste, and so that would be something like a facticity.
Hmm.
And but you see how that still relates to when you still have it like an additional ontic determination of it. So the fact that I have taste, that's part of my facticity, as well as whatever my specific personal ontic determination of it is. So it kind of includes both those things. And I think anything where it's you find yourself as what that is, you're thrown into it. I think facticity includes all those things.
So then if I said this bowl of ice cream is chocolate, that's a fact,
Factual. Yeah.
factual rather than
Yeah,
fact.
yeah. So that wouldn't be because that's obviously something related to the present at hand. Maybe there's some aspects of ready to hand in there, but for the most part, that would be the kind of the factual info about present at hand things with a capital T. And that's exactly what Heidegger is constantly saying. That's not what Dasein is. Dasein is not present at hand. Dasein is not present at hand. It's not present at hand. And just repeat ad infinitum.
And,
Yeah.
and the mode or the state, like there's the factual aspect of the entity of the bowl of chocolate existing. The mode or the state of whether or not you like chocolate or not is in like the ontological category because it's factical. But then when we have a component of self-awareness, that's when the existential comes into play, correct?
Well, hmm. Uh, so, well, at least based off the first part what you're saying, what I was thinking was that, okay, in order to encounter something as either present at hand or ready to hand entities within the world, that includes part of Dasein's ontological nature, because that's what it is. It's being in the world. It's something that's open to the world, and that's how I can encounter other entities in these different modes of present at hand, ready to hand, because it's also care. It's the being or entity that cares about its own being. And that includes, especially in its inauthentic everyday state, that it's absorbed in this concern about entities within the world. So I think part of the ontology of Dasein is exactly that, this within the worldness, which also that would be the present, and also in the everyday aspect fallenness to go along with all the other structures that are going on. So I think, okay, so a lot of what Heidegger is doing is this tripartite structure that you can think of as past, present, future. And he's got a whole bunch of different ways of re-articulating these things and even and repeating them in different ways. But I think if you at least keep to that tripartite structure, even though it has a lot of different articulations, you at least have some kind of stable basis to think about what exactly Heidegger is trying to do, which is that he thinks that Dasein, or dare I say humans, are temporal. We're fundamentally temporal, and we're oriented towards the future, our finite, our death. But most of the time, we evade that. We're inauthentic, we're lost, we're fallen, absorbed, dispersed, caught up in this limitation of our possibilities according to the they self. But what we authentically are, if we're oriented towards ourselves as what is uniquely individualized as what we are, then we're oriented towards death, our death specifically, our finitude, our ownmost possibility, and that's what Dasein is. Just think about death a lot, and there you go.
Except he does at one point say, I'm not talking about literally thinking about death.
Yeah, true, true. Yeah.
Right, like not a morbid fascination or like this, like we're black lipstick, not that I'm against that. And have that component of like, just changing your wardrobe, but like a resoluteness of the realization of the temporality, the finality of your being as a whole rather than an event that leads up to it, which gives weight or significance to the projects of care.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's right. Yeah, so one thing you can think of is sort of the way that these kind of the like transhumanists talk about, living forever. Okay, think about if that were actually possible and successful, how much that would change the way you are oriented towards your life. So imagine thinking that, okay, like all um natural death, as in like old age, senescence, anything like that, is completely eliminated. And the only thing, okay, maybe you can die from like artificial, unnatural deaths, but think about how different you would be oriented. You would, our society would become just like bubble boys, and it'd be the ultimate excuse for, I'll do it tomorrow because I'm gonna live forever. The fact that there's a finite limit that, oh, if I, you know, take action in the present according to certain possibilities, that's taking away other possibilities. Something is going on there that really matters to what I am, because what I am is ultimately kind of locked into what I become as oriented towards the future, towards my possibilities. So, in that possibility that crowns the whole operation of Dasein and its being is its death. And yeah, you become, yeah, so vampires, I don't know. Interesting. Yeah, this thought.
There's I may have mentioned this before. There's a story by Borges where, this guy's looking for the font of eternal youth. And I can't remember exactly the setting, but I think he comes to a city and there's these people laying out in this field, just kind of staring up at the sky with their mouths open. And he's looking for these people who have somehow managed to to find the secret to living forever. And it turns out it's these guys laying out there in the field staring at the sky with their mouths open, because after a while, it just, what's the point? I mean, you've done everything you can do, you've experienced everything you can experience. There's, no projects left to do. And so maybe, to Chase's point, if maybe ultimate, I mean, that's a speculation, but maybe ultimately even that is the end of all projects, because I mean they might as well be dead, right? I mean there's just nothing left.
We all become a form of Delancey's Q, which is not a good thing.
Probably not. Wouldn't recommend it.
No, no. Could be worse. We could be Romulans. Anyway, sorry.
I think I had something to say about the self thing again, but I can't really remember. what exactly that was. It's related back to the question of, well, what the hell is it and how's it related to all these different things? But so that self aspect, yeah, the so what he's um constantly railing against for everything is the present at hand. Don't confuse Dasein with the present at hand. And it's obviously true with the self. So Descartes, of course, is the ultimate model of this. And then he thinks that Kant kind of surreptitiously, to some degree, still has these aspects that are um, presuppose something about the self still being present at hand. So that he talks about the binding, which is so if I mean, I don't know Kant very well, so correct me if I'm wrong, but which I will be. That's one of the things about Kant. You can't say something about Kant without being wrong in some way. That's what I've realized.
Heidegger
So,
for me.
yeah. Okay, so you got this unity of consciousness and the transcendental unity of apperception, or all these different representations, but yet you've also got consciousness, which is a unity. So, what actually binds those things together as something that is mine? That's the transcendental unity of apperception. So, which is to use that kind of transcendental logic, that's the necessary or the condition of possibility for the fact of the unity of consciousness. So, but what Heidegger seems to be saying is wrong with that is that it's still operating at, well, you've got kind of like one empirical representation, another empirical representation, kind of its content is filled up with empirical aspects that presuppose a kind of present handness and just like a relating of things in this sequence of time that still has this priority of the present as a kind of linking of these things. And that's why he sees it as, well, there's still this connection to the priority of the present as this kind of sequence of nows, but now we have a self that is binding them in some kind of way that is indeterminate. Well, maybe the self, Kant is careful enough about that to distinguish that from the empirical content itself, sensation, but the fact that it's still interlocked in that still presupposes some aspect of the being of the present and the present at hand, along with that idea of the self. So I think that's his gripe against Kant. Although it's hard to say exactly, his solution to it is where I think it's confusing because it goes into like all of what he's talking about. And this whole thing about the wholeness and I got some of these sentences. He was like, okay, what
Oh,
the unity of the whole structure of totality of unity, whole total everythingness. I'm like, oh my God, how many like all inclusive wholenesses can you fit in one sentence? I don't know, but he's trying to do it. So the self seems to be kind of in there as at least a component, and so he still thinks of it in terms of a kind of self constancy of being, existence, but in a way that where it's not a self constancy of something as this indefinite present like an indefinite present consciousness or experience that just goes along with a succession of nows. It's the temporal aspect of it is completely different, and that's where it gets difficult, but also probably that's where Heidegger's originality lies, I'm guessing. Uh, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, him wanting to distance this self from subjectivity. And like I said, I mean, I think what you just said, Chase, um, makes me think along with that, he wants to distance it from a notion of consciousness, probably against Husserl, I'm guessing. That again, rather than it seems like Husserl makes consciousness the ground of possible being, and he's like, no. And so that's what because I'm so used to thinking of the self in terms of consciousness, it's difficult for me to think about what he means. But that seems right. He wants to say, no, the self is not primarily about consciousness. It's not subjectivity. It's it's this ontological binding of some kind of self constancy, but um, emphatically not subjective, and therefore I assume, like you said, not primarily about consciousness. But then Eric's point has said, I mean I don't know any of the literature, but that some people would say then, but that he never actually gives an adequate account of subjectivity. But maybe he would say, you know what? I don't care because that's not what I'm doing. I'm doing ontology. I'm not trying to give you an explanation of consciousness or subjectivity, but I'm trying to perhaps purge these kinds of things from ontology that have infected it from the past. Maybe you would say something like that.
And yeah, and to build on that, on what's interesting on 316, right at the end of 65, he says the interpretation of care as temporality cannot remain restricted to the narrow basis we have so far attained, even if it did take the first steps towards the primordial authentic being whole of Dasein. The thesis that the meaning of Dasein is temporality must be confirmed by the concrete content of the fundamental constitution of this being, which we have set forth. And then in 66, he's going into the aspect, like on the next page, the ontological structure of the being that I myself in each instance, this is 317, the ontological structure of the being that I myself in each instance am is centered in the self constancy of existence, because the self cannot be conceived either as a substance or as a subject, but is rather grounded in existence. Our analysis of the authentic self, the they, was left completely as part of the preparatory interpretation of Dasein. And then I can go on, but and when you couple that with temporality, unless Dasein was able to grasp its existence from a total whole perspective, the existential project he's setting forth wouldn't be possible. It almost seems like because Dasein has, in a way, in advance, an awareness of its existence as a whole through self-awareness, and through the possibility, the finality of death, that it can be enabled to inquire as to what it means to be. And I think he's saying that in the previous forms of the traditions, even though, like we may already know our existence, in a way, we become more familiar, more intimate, participatory in its structure through his existential analytical project. That's Has this been done before? Has this been proposed outside of Heidegger? Because that is really different from the previous traditions that I'm aware of up to that point in German idealism.
One thing I'm curious about, anyway, since in this section he starts talking about historicity. So I guess one thing I'm wondering about is how and this is probably I mean, I'm going to be struggling just to understand Heidegger. So I probably not even get around to this question, but Hegel, there was a big role for is that the right word, historicity? Anyway, yeah, Hegel had a deep concern with that, and so to what degree Heidegger's drawing on Hegel, I think, is an interesting question with regard to historicity.
Here's something interesting that I wanted to I think Hegel, this is just since we brought him up and how Heidegger's using him, this is not productive, but it's just I like that when any people that we read, like any good writer, brings up somebody like Kant, they have something specific, and it's like, here's this Kantian idea that I'm going to lay out. Boom, boom, boom. Here it is, and here's where I disagree. It's like a car engine that they've got in front of you, and they diagram it, and they say, here's where it's wrong. But then, if they ever borrow from Hegel, have you ever heard somebody say, here's this idea from Hegel laid out explicitly? Here's where I agree. Here's where I disagree. No, they never do that. They just kind of
Wait, how can they do that? How could they do that?
I know.
Nobody understands him enough to even say that.
Yes, that's my deep suspicion, is that nobody gets what the fuck he's talking about, and people are like, yeah, he's kind of in my thought, but I don't know where, or like, So, and it's like, and now to give you a good example, I love Hegel, but if you ask me what's Hegel's view on temporality, I would have something, but I would be doing what Chase was talking about. I'd be kind of bullshitting a little bit, and I'd be kind of like, oh fuck, where's my notes? I'd be swabbing the sweat. I get the flop sweats pretty fast. But yeah.
Yeah, so luckily we've got Heidegger to tell us all about it, because the second to last section of the book is on Hegel's view of time.
Ooh.
Okay, so I was reading a little bit of this book, The Origin of Time, Heidegger and Bergson. So first, this relates to Nevin. You're mentioning the time consciousness in Husserl. So he gives this footnote. Okay, yeah, I'll get this part of the way first. Okay, so he gives a footnote at the very end of the book that where he's kind of okay, so his thing is that there's this traditional concept of time that all started with Aristotle, and his idea is that all these philosophers who are seemingly have this radical new view of time, Bergson, Husserl, Hegel, that really they're just kind of continuing off what Aristotle said about time. And at the beginning of the book, he says that Bergson is doing this, and there's a whole bunch of stuff going on with his lecture courses before being in time, where he's very involved with Bergson in ways where this is interpretation of Bergson is that he's reversing Aristotle, but because of that, he's still under his spell. So he's still part of the traditional concept of time. So he says he's going to deal with this in the beginning of the book, being in time, if you remember, when he's talking about temporality at first. But he ends up not really dealing with it, instead puts Bergson in a footnote in the Hegel section, and he sort of says that Hegel is actually kind of like the culmination of this tradition of Aristotle's concept of time, and Bergson is actually subsumed under that. And along with that is also what he calls, so he's trying to make his theory of time distinct from all these other theories of time, including Bergson's and also Husserl's, it seems, as well, which kind of lumps in together by talking about how his idea is not time consciousness. And the exact word he uses is the one that Husserl uses a lot. Zeitbefusen or whatever, Scheißenkopfen, I don't know.
So he's saying that his conception of time is not that?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, Heidegger's like, no, fuck all those guys. I'm not Husserl. I'm not Bergson. I don't need your duration. So he's got like a pretty bad reading of Bergson, although we don't need to necessarily get into that. Although it was in this section where he's okay. Yeah, I've got never mind. I always do this. I'm like, I'm not going to talk about it, and then I start talking about it. But yeah, he's saying all these things. He's Martin goddamn Heidegger. He's doing his own thing. He's the new kid on the block. You know,
from now on, I'm giving you credit for that, Martin goddamn Heidegger.
yeah, it's goddamn right. Scheißenkopfen. I'm gonna just keep saying that until somebody calls me out on that. So the fact that this is its source, I think the ordinary conception of time, yeah, is this, tells us that the time in which what is present at hand arises and passes away is a genuine phenomena of time. It is not an externalization of a qualitative time into space, as Bergson's interpretation of time, which is ontologically quite indefinite and inadequate, would have us believe. So it's not like technically wrong, but it's highly misleading. And I think I'll probably just leave it at that because that's something I could probably talk about for like way too long. So I'm just going to take it easy on myself and give everyone else a break and not go over it. I'll just say it's Heidegger's being misleading there.
On that note too, I was going to say, like, again, I think with regard to, the earlier question about what is the self, it's not a substance, it's not a subject. I think along the way, when he's distancing this self from the Kantian subject, he's leaving out a bit, a kind of an important bit. One that, again, others have, starting with, I think, Fichte and Hegel, are saying, well, that's in there, Kant, but you didn't really quite develop it like you should have, which is the role of imagination in the synthetic unity of that perception. But furthermore, in the critique of the power of judgment, he makes much hay of imagination. And so there does seem to be something ecstatic about Kantian discursive judgment, though not fully explored within the Kantian system. And that Fichte and Hegel, to my knowledge, try to draw this out in their own distinctive ways. And he's kind of laying down, as in the self is not a subject, because the subject ends up being this kind of this static presence, so I want to say it's largely there because it wasn't, it largely lands because it's by and large how Kant describes the subject as a logical subject of discursive judgments, that you can most easily and readily conceived as the I, which is the I think before any logical judgment, right? But that's also to leave out how he deploys it within the greater system, and things that Kant was kind of indicating are also happening, right? Although Kant didn't quite emphasize.
I wanted to while we're kind of on the fuck Heidegger power hour here. That's a joke. No, just all right. So he was a little misleading with
Martin
Bergson.
goddamn Heidegger.
Martin goddamn Heidegger. He was a little bit misleading with Bergson. He was arguably a little off base with his description of the logical subject. And I have a further charge from a new camp, a new angle from which another side from which to attack. And it would be on what is this, Heidegger 320 to 321? Why is 320 so short? Yeah, so it's in the Macri Robinson, it's 367, but on the Heidegger, it's 320 to 321. He's talking about this Kantian analysis, and he says this kooky thing that it's actually right at the start. It's actually like right at the end of 320 and the very beginning of 321. It's that paragraph, and I'll just read this little bit, and then I'll give my thing, which is coming from a Hegelian concern. How does it come about that while the I think gives Kant a genuine phenomenal starting point, he cannot exploit it ontologically and has to fall back on the subject, in quotes, that is to say, something substantial, question mark? The I is not just an I think, but an I think something, and does blah, 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 blah. Okay, getting more into his criticism of Kant. That sentence, he cannot exploit it on that phrase of that sentence. He cannot exploit it ontologically and has to fall back on the subject. That is to say, something substantial. All I'll say, this is not like a knockdown thing, because he is deploying the word subject in a particular way here. Specifically, the subject. The word "the" is doing a lot of work in that sense. The subject as a discrete object or element. Heidegger, from my perspective, Heidegger in a way is conflating subject and substance. Heidegger is making a statement here. I don't know if this is his statement, like this is the thesis, but it comes across as if it's saying subjects are substantial things. Subject, the only way that the word subject can have any meaning is in reference to a thing that is a substantial thing. And I would challenge that. I would say that there is a history of analysis of this same subject in the wake of, like Eric, like you were saying, those challenges are regarding the ecstasies, I suppose, that were coming from Fichte and Hegel. I think that a part of that was reopening the field of what of subject, of subjectivity and of subject. And I think there's a reason that Hegel can say subject is substance without meaning to say, or substance is subject, without meaning to say that substance is like the mind of a subjective person. You know what I'm saying? There's a big difference between saying substance is subject and saying substance is a subject or the subject. And what I would think he means in the first sentence, what he said, substance is subject, is to say that the mode of substantiality it's a failed category. It doesn't work. Any possible term that can be proposed for substantiality, for the substance, the han kai pan of it all, the substance, it doesn't work. It always collapses or has some sort of inconsistency or incoherence at some point. And so the only thing that can work relative as a term for substance is something that is directly not substance, that is subject. And that's not to say it is a specific entity or even a collection of entities or any object in space. Subject by Hegel is being used to mean a phenomena, or a set of phenomena, or a phenomenon that I think certain Hegel scholars would call like a torsion or a twistedness or a certain invertedness within the order of the logic of being. And I know I'm not clarifying what I'm meaning here, but I'm just trying to, just for the sake of, people say that stuff, okay? So what I'm saying is there's totally a mode by which one can say subject, and in fact a German one, a German idealist one that was done by Hegel, who was allegedly by old Marty. He was like the culmination of all this metaphysical project hoo-ha, and he was all the respect in the world, golf claps for that guy. But if he had done, I argue that if Marty had done his homework on this matter, I think that I would at least expect to find some word here on subject in its meanings outside of it being the subject or a subject, which seems to be the only meaning that he's applying here. Which is so because I'm kind of a pro subject guy, I guess. Maybe that's I'm doing a sort of panegyric or whatever. I'm attacking him because I have this personal bent. But yeah, that's a problem. I just wanted to, and I'm only saying this because I felt like I would feel bad if I never said anything. If I didn't bring it up, I would feel like I missed out on clarifying something. It is possible to think of the word subject in a way that does not mean a thing present at hand, or even a thing ready to hand. I don't know. Never mind. Scratch that second half of that sentence. I don't know how those terms work well enough, but not a thing present at hand. I know that. You can say subject without it meaning things.
I think that's a reasonable thing to bring up.
So even though by inclination, I think I have to point out for full disclosure that I'm proximately and for the most part in a negative subject person. But I think Henry, I think you make a valid point though, and that I think he is so he's trying to do this kind of like destruction of the history of ontology kind of thing. And I think because of that, there's something kind of like, okay, he's working with certain terms in their most kind of stratified way and trying to kind of operate against those. And I think that's why something like subject or substance, he'll use something like the most reified version of them. And where we can easily think of all these different ways that, you can have a different concept of the subject or a different concept of substance. Like Spinoza had a different concept of substance than Descartes. And he never mentions Spinoza once in this book. So, but so another thing, going back, so Eric, you said you're talking about the imagination as being involved with the Kantian self, which I thought was interesting because, so Heidegger, I know his reading of Kant. I mean, I've never read this book, but I think it's Kant in the Problem of Metaphysics or something like that. I know he emphasizes the role of the imagination so the imagination is, what binds the intuition and the understanding, right? So I think he puts a lot of stock in that as like, that's where Kant's metaphysics is in this kind of like presupposition of the imagination that connects all these things. So it's interesting that still, and at least in this book, he never brings that up, at least. But I don't know. Not that that's like a damning thing exactly against Heidegger, but it's still kind of interesting to see there's certain gaps kind of going on here where you're like, I don't know, Heidegger, what's going on?
I wouldn't be surprised if in the course of writing Being and Time, he had a certain conception, like you were saying, a very stratified, reified conception of what Kant was doing. And then after writing Being in Time, some Kantians came to him and said, look, you totally like left out the whole role of the imagination in the Kantian system. So you kind of like hitting a straw man a bit there, dude. And so he comes back and says, oh yeah, no, actually, that's right. At the same time, Kant didn't take it far enough. You know what I mean? Like he hit on something good, but he didn't develop it in the right way. And so, I think that to my mind, that seems quite plausible that in the later work, did Kant and the problem or the problematic metaphysics, didn't that come a few years after Being in Time?
I think it was pretty soon after, or I think some people actually say that. So the part that Heidegger didn't write of Being in Time, the part two, I think it would be, or I think it's supposed to be part three, or I don't know. But the part that he didn't write, that some of what his answer would have been is in the Kant book, because that was so yeah. There's still the somewhere in this he's got the table of contents of what the full project would have been, and I think it has something in there about Kant's conception of time, and that's what he gets into in his Kant book, which definitely is after Being in Time. Yeah.
One thing I wondered, and if part of his criticism of Kant is, well, or maybe this is just my thing. I was told Eric this before. One of the things that annoys me about Kant is he says the transcendental subject is not a thing, but then he calls it the transcendental ego. And I'm like, if you're going to call it an ego, you're just inviting people to think of it as a thing. I mean, go ahead, Eric.
Be careful where he uses the phrase the transcendental ego, though, because he uses that phrase in the paralogisms as a kind of like, I'm saying the synthetic unity of this I is not a thing, it's not a substance, it's more an activity, it's a function. So in the first part, in the analytic, he's laying down, it's all synthetic unity of apperception. And he's talking about its functionality. Then later on in the paralogisms, he's showing, like what's needed, what's transcendentally necessary is the function and not a substance as such that underlies the function. And so when he's referring to the substance conceived as such, then he's using this transcendental ego. But usually when he uses the phrase transcendental ego, it's in a kind of negative sense, not in a kind
I thought that he actually used transcendental ego as a positive, I don't know, as something that sort of houses or embodies these transcendental properties almost.
I think Husserl does. But yeah, the paralogisms are that's what Heidegger mentions as kind of, we still need to be able to, I think that's one thing he's taking from Kant is the concern to avoid the paralogisms, and he thinks that at least Kant is right to, because I mean it's a lot of it is like a critique of Descartes, so of course Heidegger would doubt that. So I think he wants to take that aspect of what is like substantiality of the self, of like constancy and personality, those three things that he mentions, and says, yeah, we need to kind of take up Kant's project, at least in terms of avoiding the paralogisms. I think I remember something like that. I'm obviously paraphrasing, but yeah, but that's kind of, at least I mean, I know, so Heidegger wasn't saying exactly this about Kant, but the whole idea of something that Kant is kind of critiquing, that it's kind of being associated with him. Well, that's exactly what he's doing with Bergson. He's making it seem as if like his idea of time is that it's space. And that's exactly the opposite of Bergson. Bergson does not think that. So I don't know. I think Heidegger he's definitely using these philosophers for his own project. And part of this is, he's writing a book. He can't explain every aspect of these people to us. Uh, so he's got to just do enough, but he gives a view that helps further his point. And because of that, yeah, I don't know. I think you can see where some of what he's saying about Kant, I think I could definitely see that as being kind of, I don't know, he's kind of oversimplifying it to some degree, although he sort of has to, but but the Bergson one as just like a sentence, like not even it's like a clause, just like, oh, just writing it off. Um, yeah, I don't know.
It's like saying Bergson fucked up. Trust me.
Yeah, pretty much. But then saying that like the reason he fucked up is because of this thing that he was actually critiquing, but saying it as if he's putting that forward as his actual idea, and then ignoring all the similarities with your own project with this person who, 30 years before you was already gave you kind of the major distinctions of your own project, like originary time versus derivative time, ordinary conception of time. Yes, the ideas of those are different, but there's a lot with their projects that are similar that it seems like Heidegger took his orientation from Bergson and then kind of sweeps that under the rug, gives like one aspect of one thing that Bergson critiqued, and then presents it as this like that's his theory. And it's ontologically indeterminate. Well, you say that about everything, Heidegger, so okay. Rest my case. Guilty.
To be fair, I mean, I take him as criticizing both Kant and Bergson in the same way that we all today criticize Descartes, just on this ground, right? Like in the first meditation, the project is to get rid of unjustified dogmas, you know? But we all understand he smuggled unjustified dogmas back in, right? So he kind of fell short on his own project. And to be frank, like I think Kant also falls a bit short on his own project. But I don't know if Heidegger's, I mean, he's onto something, but I think he overemphasizes this aspect for his project, right? And he kind of minimized. And I think probably similar with Bergson, he may have a valid point that Bergson set out to, say something about time, such and such, and that he didn't quite succeed. Like, and again, like I've been saying since we started, and many others after Heidegger have said he didn't quite succeed in moving beyond subject object. You know what I mean? Or removing the subject from its center in modern philosophy. So without saying, and I'm inclined to take your word, Chase, that Heidegger is being unfair here to Bergson. But just to clarify and take that to be his point.
This may be completely off base, but I mean, doesn't Kant, when he gets to the ethics, pretty much reify the self as a eternal soul, something like that?
It depends. It depends on how not as an object of knowledge, certainly not as something that we can reasonably believe.
Yeah, I mean, maybe not. I was wondering if maybe that might be part of Heidegger's complaint too, is like ultimately he capitulates and treats the subject as a substance. But I don't know. His target seems to be mostly critique of pure reason, so maybe not.
Another interesting thing. So because I haven't gotten this off my bingo card yet. So you're talking about different ways of thinking about Kant's idea of the self that are interesting. So Deleuze actually has a pretty interesting take on it, where he emphasizes that there's a difference between the transcendental aspect of the self and the empirical. So he sees this as a fracture within the self, within thought. So that thought is kind of like this difference within the self, split between transcendental and empirical. So there's another aspect of you can find some interesting things going on there. I was wondering if I could, so I tried to see if there's something about that in Heidegger's account, and I didn't necessarily catch it, except he talks about, there's the I think something, and the something is something empirical. So he does kind of catch on to that connection, but then the way that he frames that connection is totally different from the way that at least Deleuze frames it. But he's specifically more talking about it in terms of the self and the difference between transcendental and empirical, and not the self, the transcendental unity of apperception is binding, and then what it actually binds the representations. So they're talking about something different. But anyways, I just thought that was an interesting point to make, and so take that off your bingo card. Yeah.
I think that's relevant. I want to say kind of, I don't know, without looking at Deleuze, it seems to be, he's criticizing Heidegger as well. The gap between the transcendental and the empirical arguably is reproduced in Heidegger as the ontological difference between the ontological and the ontic.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on with the ontological difference, which also becomes a pretty major concern also with the later Heidegger.
Or maybe this is the same thing, ready to hand versus present at hand. So when I'm treating things as present, I can never remember which is which. When I'm treating things as present at hand, it seems I'm more likely to think of myself as something interacting with the world of things. Whereas when I'm engaged with a project and things primarily emerge as ready to hand, I mean, there's all, people frequently bring up these notions of like when you're really engaged in some kind of project and you kind of disappear. Like, in class, I use these examples, like if you're a soccer player and you're running out on the field and you're doing your thing, and the awareness of self kind of you sort of efface the sense of self. It kind of falls into the background. And I think of that as kind of a ready to hand kind of existence, because these things are just part of your world and you're activating, and the sense of self as a discrete object sort of fades away, or at least fades way back into the background. Whereas when I'm thinking about things and objects and interacting with them, I'm more likely to think of myself as as like this thing that's interacting with other things. So I don't know, but there seems to be maybe, kind of a similar difference there as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, I don't want to oversimplify and I don't want to overstate this case, but there's definitely, and to my mind, there seems to be a lineage between Kant's theoretical reason and practical reason.
Mm.
And then Heidegger's, the world of beings conceived as present to hand, the world of beings conceived as ready to hand. Again, there's changes along the way, mutations along the way, permutations, but it seems to me like there's a comparable kind of division there.
Maybe it's just another case of what you guys have been talking about, is he borrows and claims he's making a greater break than perhaps he really is. I just want to know for note for the record that, to my best recollection, tonight I got through an entire discussion without mentioning Nietzsche, I think.
Before now, right before now, yes.
Except until now.
Yeah, so that was a self-sublating comment right there.
There you go.
Just something I tried to teach my my nieces. Is one of them said that no one's talking. It was something like that. And I was like, oh, you're Hegelian. It's a self-sublating statement, assertion, judgment, syllogism right there. And yeah, it was very good. Wait, what holiday was that? I don't know.
Juneteenth.
Not too long ago. Yeah.
Yes.
They have a kind of Hegelian satori where they kind of like, I get it.
What
I
am
think
I?
they got it in the like, yeah, by saying that it's no longer quiet, so your comment negates itself.
Right.
One of my favorites is when, again, as a teacher, this sometimes happens, right? You're in your classroom, you're by yourself, and then students come in, and you oftentimes the first one and the second one to come in, they'll look around the room and they'll say something like, "Oh, there's nobody here," or "There's nobody here yet." And I oftentimes want to respond by like, "Poof," I'm like, I just cease to exist, like lean into it. Like, what am I, chopped liver to you? You know what I mean? Of course, there's nobody here. What? Look, hi. I know.
There's no real people. You're just sort of like a thing they have to put up with. You're like an object that they have to tolerate.
President at hand.
He's like he's like part of the podium and that shit up there.
Yeah,
camera and stuff.
Well,
the computer that speaks at him.
Grade slot machine. You pull the hand and then some grade spits out.
Well, haven't you ever noticed? Did you ever bump into one of your students at the grocery store? They're shocked. It's like,
Yeah.
"Oh, Dr. Mahogany." It's like, "Yes, I buy food and prepare it at home." I just don't live in my office and come out to teach you and then go back into my coffin. And, that's how I subsist. I'm a human being, but they're just so shocked to see me in a different environment.
I've got a former student who works at the HEB that I regularly shop at, and he's been working there for 2 or 3 years. And like half the time I go in, I see him there, and half the time I see him there, he'll jump into whatever line, and be like, "Here, let me get this guy's order." Like, he always likes to say hi. So I don't know. He's one of my HEB buddies.
Yeah. On the other hand, when I told this story, I met a student at an art event that my daughter was at, and this student said, "You made me work for my bee." This was an accusation.
How dare you?
How dare you?
How dare you? God, what were you
Oh,
thinking?
God.
You
I remember.
are.
Okay, so my mom used to teach middle school. It was like a sub or so, and I remember once I was at HEB. I was basically like a little kid. I was probably in elementary school, and this student that she had subbed, it's like, "You're that mean lady who gave me a C," or something like that, no, I think it was a detention, or I think that was it. Actually, it wasn't a grade; it was a detention or something like that. And my mom was just like, "Yeah, you deserved it." And I remember it was a very high tense moment. I was just like, "What is going on?" Like, there's drama occurring at HEB with like some like ninth grader. Yeah, probably did deserve it because it was very like, you see a professor gave you a detention at HEB and you're just like, "You're a mean lady." Like, yeah, you probably deserved it. Yeah. Guilty.
I should have said that. I didn't think about it. Well, shall we adjourn until next time.
Thanks
Where
very much for tonight. It was helpful.
Yeah.
I am so hopeful, probably without justification, that temporality will begin to make more sense to me, because the next several sections all have the word temporality in them.
Oh yeah, it's nothing but temporality from here on out.
Okay, well,
Yep.
the temporality of discourse, the temporality of everydayness, the temporality of attunement. Okay, so here we go. Maybe I'll make some sense of it. Anyway.
Keep going at it, and eventually it'll make sense to you.
Yeah, like I've told students when they see this stuff is hard, I tell them the first time I read Aristotle, it felt like I put my head down and ran full speed into the wall, backed up and did it again, and just did that over and over and over until my skull and brain were battered and squishy enough to where it could start to seep in. So yeah, that's what philosophy's like.
Yeah, and you gotta stay soft and malleable, or else it'll start to calcify up there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Plasticity. Yep.
yeah.
Brain.
Uh, well,
Okay. Well, nighty night.
Have a
Peace be
nice
with y'all.
Fourth if I don't see y'all.
oh yeah, have a
You
good
too.
4th. Yeah, peace.